Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for tuning into the Sustainability Summit 2022. I hope you've been adding your comments and your questions on our social media platforms. That is hashtag SUSWeek 2022. Thank you so much also for engaging on our online platform and our online chat. We are receiving the comments. You keep it alive, you keep it going. Still on sustainability, we are now talking about sustainable transport and mobility. Joining me on this panel discussion, we have our esteemed guests, Mr. Heaton Palmer, Executive and Thought Leader at Renewable Electric Mobility Program. We have Mr. Vishal Luchman, who's Managing Director at Transport Zutari. We also have Mr. Gavin Kelly, CEO for Road Freight Association. We have Mr. Winston Jordan, MD for Grid Cars. Welcome to all of you, and thank you very much for joining us. Perhaps we can start with you, Mr. Kelly, and then we'll go to Mr. Jordan, and yeah.
Good morning, everyone. Hopefully you're all enjoying the wonderful load shedding like we are here. So there's a little delay. Try and push messages between towers with a long stick these days.
Sure.
As Trade Association is the largest representative of road freight. Some people call them hauliers, but road freight companies or operators in the country. And one of the things that we have discussed in great detail over the last couple of years, but is becoming more and more of an issue, is the type of energy that will drive the various vehicles and the various operations within road freight logistics. So, looking forward to some interesting debate. Right now, as we speak, we've got a whole team that's in Germany looking at hydrogen. They're not in the Ukraine, by the way. I think that's the second part of it. Anyway, you're now chatting to you the rest of the morning. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Kelly. Thank you. Mr. Jordan?
Thank you. I think anybody looking at hydrogen in Ukraine probably isn't looking at it for transport, maybe for something a little bit more explosive. But yeah, so I'm Winston Jordan. I'm the CEO of Grid Cars. We focus our efforts mostly into the development of electric vehicle charging infrastructure and the support of that infrastructure. So looking at what sits behind it in terms of the energy. So certainly trying to move as much as possible towards renewables. And I think the main objective for me is the future of transport, without any doubt, lies within electric. There may well be transitional technology that we see, between now and the next 5 years as the batteries catch up to some level. We may see the uses of gases and hydrogens and all of these other ideas. But the long game for me is absolutely electric, and that's what we have focused as Grid Cars, is how do we address that long game? And I think that's where all of the different industries will move to eventually.
Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Jordan. We look forward to engaging further, especially with our energy crisis in Africa as well. So thank you for that. Can we have Mr. Palmer?
Thank you, Tabang, and good morning to you all. As introduced, I'm Heaton Palmer, Director of the Renewable Electric Mobility Program. We've been active for the last 9 years in South Africa and internationally on enabling the ecosystem around electric mobility. Important to note, in every market and every region, it's not just about the mobility platform, it's really an ecosystem approach from government's role in policies, regulations, and standards, but key around the value chain of the development of the market, from infrastructure to mobility, roads, skills development, as well as end-of-life management. So we've been enabling this ecosystem in South Africa and look forward to the conversations in a very topical theme today and event as well.
Awesome. Thank you very much for that, Mr. Palmer. Can we have Mr. Luchman?
Good morning, and thank you for inviting me to be on your panel. I look after the transport business at Zutari. Zutari is currently, and this year will be 90 years old. We're a professional services consultancy firm. I look after one of the 6 verticals, which is the transport business. And I look forward to contributing meaningfully to this discussion today. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you very much. Maybe we can just, kickstart with the general question. When we talk about sustainable transport and mobility, what do we mean? And maybe we can start with Mr. Jordan. Give us the context of what we are talking about today.
Sure. I think, again, I'm probably a little bit biased. I'm going to say it absolutely means it's electric. And a big part of that would also mean that the energy sources are sustainable. So certainly that the transition is sustainable. So it's, I don't think we want to be talking about technology where we're going to switch to technology 3 years later, we're going to switch to something else. We've got to be looking at something that is sustainable now and it can take us forward, because this is going to cause, as Hitten hinted or stated very clearly, it's going to make a really big change to this ecosystem. And if we're going to have to make the change again, I think because we picked the wrong technology, that to me is the critical part. So a big part of the sustainability is really understanding clearly what the future is, and secondly, making sure that everything that goes into that is recyclable, is renewable, is following all climate mitigation strategies that we look at.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Kelly, can you come in there as well?
Sure. I think not only do I have load shedding, I think I have the local Air Force here practicing for an air show. So that's not thunder. Yeah, what is sustainability? So when I started, I spoke about one part which had to do with energy. But in terms of road freight, in terms of the whole logistics chain, what we look at is a whole series of parts or key links in this logistics chain. So we look at the ports, the way in which they operate, the way in which they compete with the rest of the world, and how we sustain our trade moving into South Africa and through South Africa. South Africa has been, up to now, a reasonably important part in terms of getting freight into the greater continent. And when we have the African Free Trade Agreement, that's going to place a huge amount of pressure on us. So it's all about clearing systems and SARS, et cetera, et cetera. Rail needs to play its role. We have let ourselves down as a country in terms of what rail needs to do. Very best should be playing in are collapsing. We've got one or two good stories, but where it really needs to be functioning, it seems to be going wrong, and we need to understand why it's like that. Our roads, at the moment, we are riding on roads that were built many, many years ago. More than 80% of the roads in South Africa were built before the 70s. They weren't built for the types of volumes of vehicles moving on them, never mind the masses of the volumes. We've got to look after those. Energy, I spoke about very briefly in terms of how we're going to sustain and keep ourselves going. Workforce, there are huge changes coming in the workforce. How we used to employ people and what people used to do, and the whole advent of AI, artificial intelligence, which my wife says I, but anyway, AI, or whether it's OIR or whatever the case may be, is going to have a huge effect on sustainability of the citizenry. We've got to look at logistics, the way in which logistics are moved around the country. What's happened in the Ukraine, what COVID did, has made huge changes in terms of the way goods flow around the country. And then finally, the hidden little piece, which is packaging, and the way in which consumers these days consume their goods and get their goods. So all of those things are going to link it. Is one of those things.
Yeah, you touched on a very critical thing, packaging, which is interchangeable with food security. Yesterday we were discussing how quality of a product is actually diminished because of how it's transported and how it is packaged. So thank you for touching on that. I look forward to exploring that further. Can we have Mr. Palmer? What is sustainable transportation and mobility?
Yeah, so I think, on the sustainability agenda, it's not just about the mobility platform. I think, the whole market, globally, we're experiencing a technology revolution. Energy is changing, mobility is changing, but also consumer behavior. So, when we look at the technology side, electric is certainly one of the leading solutions around that. But the whole transport dynamic, it's what's framed across three pillars: avoid, shift, and improve. Because all of that needs to change. Consumer behavior needs to change in terms of that. But until, on the sustainability agenda, that's really what's improving it. If we look at, traditional technologies of petrol and diesel, that technology is being wasteful in terms of that from a sustainability perspective. You're looking at the efficiencies of battery electric, certainly well advanced in terms of that, and the efficiency in terms of that. You're looking at the maturity of technologies in the energy sector, the value chain efficiencies from generation of electricity to power electric mobility is just a no-brainer from that perspective. And in the circular economy, we're looking at maturity of technologies in the recycling economy, where you're seeing recovery of metals that are feeding back into the supply chain. So really, sustainability's really come at the forefront, not only in technologies, but even in consumer choices. So I think, sustainability is a key topic in everything. You're looking at ESG, financing mechanisms. It's really a thematic area that speaks to everything. And when you're looking at what technology is providing, you've got a solution in every market in terms of that. So it's really a topical point. And when we look at transportation, there is a key role that it plays, not only moving people, but goods as well. And like Gavin also alluded to, there's key developments on that front, rail, road, marine, and aviation as well. Moving into electric in terms of that.
Thank you very much. Mr. Lushman, can you come in here? I have a show.
Thank you.
Oh, there we go.
Yeah, hi.
Awesome.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, I'd like to discuss this sustainability a little bit more at a system level. When we talk about, you spoke about what do I think sustainability in transport means. I'm tended to be drawn towards the SDGs, for example, that have been in place for a while now. But I think more than just using an academic approach towards implementing or talking about SDGs is the adaptation of SDGs for the South African context. And I think there's nuances across the continent as well. What comes to mind is on demand. Now, that on demand is a concept that is playing out in the freight space as well as in the public space. And it has an element of time attached to that. So on-demand freight logistics is really driven by the e-commerce and the on-demand and buying online and things like that are driving that conversation. And the integration of various transport opportunities or options within densely populated areas also leaves room for a discussion on how we integrate and provide a one-stop solution using the opportunities available to us. So when it comes to sustainability, there's two broad areas, and I kept it to the land discussion, not the water discussion, around freight and public. And as it pertains to, maybe if I get a little bit more granular, sustainability within the South African context, and I could use maybe three concepts to describe that, and I'll start with one of them now. One is leadership, okay? The leadership conversation around sustainability within the country. I think there is not enough happening along those lines. Leadership does create the enabling environment, motivates for the regulatory regime to change, structural reforms to happen. And I think there's not enough happening in that regard. There might be a bit of talk around it, but not enough happening. There's also the adoption of a sustainability ideology or methodology in incorporating the local nuances. In other words, when we talk about sustainability, I heard my colleagues talk about technology, talk about power. Now, these are, in my mind, enabling societies to connect with each other. They enable economic growth to happen. But again, that's a gap for us in that sense.
Yes.
The last concept is the concept of time. Now, sustainability, in my mind, has a time concept to it. In other words, we cannot wait forever to get around to doing things. I feel that in the South African context, we have developed a maturity almost to wait. And that, in my mind, poses another risk to us because the evolution of technology in the sustainability discussion is not waiting for anyone. So that would be the last concept. And how do we work with the concept of time to progress our sustainability initiatives so that we make material connections with our socioeconomic issues and the growth and the development that is required in that space? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Mr. Kelly, maybe you can come in here. Are we ready for the evolution that Mr. Luchman is talking about, the evolution in the transportation sector, particularly where AI and 4IR are concerned? Are we ready as a continent for some of those pursuits?
I don't think you're ever ready for evolution. Evolution isn't something that you can see in the distance. You can see trends, but evolution happens around you. So one of the most important things about Africa, and I think the rest of the world is quite jealous about us, and you see it in South Africa as well, with our myriad of challenges. And I think that's the important thing. And that's what everyone in the panel this morning has said so far. I haven't heard anyone talk about problems. I've heard about challenges. I've heard about changes. I've heard about how things develop or evolve. So we're all willing to evolve. That's the important thing. Well, I'm making the presumption everyone is willing to evolve.
Sure.
There are of us who resist change or we resist evolving, and it's driven by a number of things. One of the most simple things is going to be whether I can afford. So I'll hang on to the technology I have or the systems that I have because I have vested in these in a huge way, whether it's either been financially or it's been from a resource of an infrastructure way. And some of those are very, very, very visible to us. The way in which the railways works, the way in which the railways develop, or the way in which the railways didn't develop. So there was a lot of development into almost the beginning of the 80s. I think the last large railway construction development was Dana Shishan lines and the Richards Bay lines. There wasn't any thought, and this is not a political discussion. What I'm trying to understanding of is that evolution, we evolve with it. So now we look at what's happening in power space. Talking on too long, please, more than welcome to stop me. Yesterday we had a discussion around the nuances between electric vehicles and hydrogen vehicles. There are those companies who are already pushing electric vehicles in as what's the right term? As first sort of level, you call them 1G type vehicles. They're brand new. There are lots of problems with them. But for those who will start evolving the minute they see something different, and there will always be those who are going to hang on to tried and trusted ways until all of their little questions and insecurities about the product are proven absolutely unfounded. So, for example, one of the things with electricity, and I'm not here to punt either electricity or hydrogen or anything, one of the things with electricity that over the last 3 years, you've seen massive changes in has been the weight of the batteries. Because obviously on a truck, you want to put cargo, and if your batteries weigh more than your cargo, then I may as well just keep driving a diesel vehicle. So you see this development happening. So evolution, I think, I would, on behalf of all South Africans, whether I'm mandated or not, I would say we're all chomping at the bit to evolve in the affordability, the accessibility. In other words, how easily can you get this? And then, of course, whether this is really going to be sustainable in terms of maintenance and doing the job. So, yes, we are ready to evolve.
100%. Thank you very much for that, Mr. Kelly. Perhaps Mr. Jordan and Mr. Palmer, you can answer this interchangeably because you are in the, electric vehicle making space. How do I put this? Do we have capacity to go completely on electric cars? Like, obviously, because now, petrol and diesel and battery motor vehicles are being phased out and they're phasing in electric vehicles. Do we have the capacity for that? And maybe, Mr. Jordan, you can manufacturing space, you look at the charging and accessibility. So are we ready for electric vehicles?
We can't afford not to be ready.
Sure.
That's the first thing. And I think this is something, for me is sort of a theme of how we do business as well. And that is that we have to solve the problems we've got without any doubt. But the problems that bringing electric is not going to make these problems all. If you look, for example, if we could make all road transport electric overnight, we would need to produce about 12 to 15% more power. So it's not like we get 10 times more power. And that wouldn't happen overnight. It could happen over a 10 or 20 year period. So we have a lot of time to adjust to that. So it doesn't mean we don't have issues, and we've got to deal with those issues. The challenge is going to be cleaning that thing, making sure that it is a environmentally aligned energy that we're working with or that we're using. Said, even if we're using dirty coal burning fuel, we're still 3 times cleaner than a typical diesel engine would be in terms. So from that perspective, electric is still by far more sustainable, even if we don't get the value chain clean. But we do need to clean the value chain. We do need to fix our issues that we're having with electricity. We do need to look at redesigning some of our endpoints. And with the because the thing that chargers need is they need lots of power at one place. So it's not as much about the energy and much more about the power. So look at that, because that is going to put some extra strain if we don't get involved in designing that now. So we're not in major problems with that sort of thing today, but 3 or 4 years from now, we're going to hit problems if we haven't started to think now about how those design changes have to happen and how we should look at that. So I think that's all part of this. But maybe one of the most important parts for me is that you can make your own energy in your own property. So various big logistics companies, and we're looking at 5 and 10-year strategy models for them. And they're really taking control of that energy production side. So they're putting in huge solar plants, or they're planning to, and that will mean that they're controlling their own energy. And when you control your own energy, you're not exposed to fluctuations in the rand, fluctuations in fuel prices. It gives you a lot more stability in your business models, a lot more predictability in how you're approaching things. So my absolute opinion, I'll end with what I started with, and that is we cannot afford not. And I think, the last part of that is a lot of the newer technologies. We speak about hydrogen. I think hydrogen is great technology. We're going to see some really interesting products coming through that. But hydrogen itself is not by any means the solution to transport.
No.
Hydrogen, no, what I mean is that hydrogen, there's no such thing as a hydrogen vehicle. They're all hydrogen battery hybrids. So they still have batteries inside of them, because you can't deliver the power with hydrogen. You can only deliver the energy. So what we're seeing is that even the successful hydrogen vehicles are by far battery electric vehicles. Hydrogen is just used to give range. So they're actually battery electric vehicles that they're driving. And I think we're going to see a lot of those hybrid technologies over the next sort of 5 years.
So Palmer, maybe you can come in here, and Mr. Luchman as well. Palmer, we can start with you. What can you add from what Mr. Jordan has shared?
Yeah, so I think, on the transition into electric mobility, especially in the South African and African case, and just South African case, the load shedding and energy crisis is an unavoidable topic. But if we take a step back, we look at, over the many years that we've started, we've experienced load shedding. What has it actually done in South Africa? Yes, it's disrupted business, it's disrupted home, your home environment as well. But if we look at it, there's been an explosion of the renewable energy market in South Africa. In 2021, South Africa ranked top 10 in the global energy storage market for residential storage applications. And this just showed that what happened. So out of the crisis that we're facing, it actually strengthened the grid in home environments, business environments, as Winston also alluded to. Not also forgetting that the price of solar and batteries have radically come down. So now there's a strong business case for every homeowner and every business operator in fleets to install solar if they haven't already, and then transition to electric mobility onto that. It's certainly a no-brainer case from that perspective. Your total operating costs also extend from that perspective as well. I think the crisis we're facing is certainly relative and always retrospect when we have that conversation about electric mobility. But if you chat to any EV driver now and you ask them, is load shedding a problem? The answer is no. What's the challenge? Because you can schedule your charging in your home system, in your vehicle, and your broader energy management system, and that's really where it is. And there's so much activity happening in grid strengthening in remote areas, national levels, municipality as well as utility. So it's a short-term problem.
Can you add on those sentiments?
I think I can add on, but in a different context. Again,
Please do.
Keeping it a little bit at a macro level. My comment is that we've mentioned the word transition and transformation, quite extensively, especially and coupled with the technology advancement as well. So, putting on a different, hat, I'm looking at who are we leaving behind in this discussion, because I come to the conclusion that much of this technology is really playing in one part of the economy, and I go back to an opportunity perhaps missed or in need of discussion with regard to how do we bridge into the inequality discussion that we are currently having? How do we create opportunity in this transition process towards empowering and educating and transforming society overall to become more sustainable? Because in my opinion, we need sustainable communities, sustainable societies, systems and methodologies that work to enable a sustainable transport system. Because if we have that to be unsustainable, we are going to find huge frustration that the solutions do not fit all of us. It may only fit a few of us because we might be able to afford it, whilst others cannot. So I think, in my mind, there's a certain element of the discussion or group that is left behind in the sustainability discussion. And that is why I say an overarching sustainability framework is required. And what's currently in our books or in our documents or in our methodologies is not sufficient and not well integrated to have this discussion, because it inevitably ends up being a granular discussion, because it becomes opportunistic, because there's no strategy linked to it. So what's going to happen is, sitting in a derivative market like South Africa, all we're going to do is buy technology that is provided by others. And that is where the opportunities must, because we could change the rhetoric and use SDG 11 coupled with sustainable communities, coupled with technology, woven into one to provide solutions for ourselves by ourselves. And that will now bring in the concept of educating society, quality of the technology, developing infrastructure for ourselves by ourselves, which helps us to become a more sustainable community and then appreciate sustainable transport much better and maybe more holistically. Thank you.
And thank you very much for that. Do you think, just on the note of transition, maybe Mr. Kelly, you can come in here. How does this transition better address issues around the global CO2 emissions that we know the transportation industry is quite responsible for?
Well, the jury's out on that one in some respects. If you're going to reduce the amount of fossil fuel combustion, which has a large amount of CO2 emission into it or from it, then obviously the less fuel you burn, the less CO2 emissions they're going to be, and so the carbon footprint looks a lot better. But that isn't the only part where carbon footprint is in terms of transportation. If we're talking about sustainability in the greater sphere, and remember, I'm in transport, so I'm going to walk out a thin piece of ice right here now, so please don't shoot me right away. There are lots of other things that impact us in the transport industry that have a carbon footprint. So packaging is one of them, and that's why I raised that in terms of sustainability and some of the things we're looking at. So, for example, the way in which we package our products and the way in which they are displayed has a huge CO2 footprint as well. So when we start looking at changing or wanting to affect a CO2 footprint, it requires really three things that one needs to look at. And I think Vishal raised it in his last comment. So the first thing is, how much fossil fuel do we use? And there's always this discussion, can we drop fossil fuel tomorrow? And what would then be the replacement thereto? And are we going to end up with some other byproduct which is maybe worse than carbon emissions? And please, I'm not a proponent for carbon emissions. I'm just saying, so, when we make these moves, and I think even Winston maybe said it earlier on, we've got to think about how we move and where we move and what we move to. But more importantly, we need to actually wean ourselves. This can't be this huge just axe that falls. So what we definitely do in the transport industry is those companies that are coming in, those small companies, and those are the guys that actually struggle with that first hurdle. It's the economic, daunting mountain of buying cleaner energy, okay? Because a vehicle is far more expensive than, in this case, many of them start a second-hand diesel vehicle that's really done a couple of 100,000 Ks. So how do we get them? How do we get those entrants into the market and that level of the market to not only look at what their vehicle puts out, but what the rest of their operations put out in terms of a carbon footprint. And how do they change that behavior? I do not pretend to be a carbon footprint specialist, please. And then the final is always going to be, it's always going to be, what did we have before coal? What did that do? What footprint did that do? So now we've got coal. Our next levels of whatever energy we're going to put in, we need to make sure, and this is the important thing, is that it is sustainable. And I think Winston pointed towards that. So hydrogen right now seems to be the answer. And well, in freight, it's an answer in terms of one of the challenges, which is batteries. I'm not saying it's the route we're going and only going, but what's the byproduct? And what is the waste? And how are we going to deal with that? I'm going to...
Oh, is that way? I thought you were going to go on maybe. Okay.
Let's let the other speak a bit.
Okay, cool. Mr. Jordan, maybe you can come in here. You know, you mentioned the importance of also, shifting the value chain and changing the value chain. So what elements have you identified that need to be changed in this value chain? And how can we ensure that environmental alignment that you spoke about?
Sure. I think I'm going to sound like I keep repeating myself. We've got to move to solar. We've got to move to renewable sources. That is that value chain. And I mean, maybe just to pick up on what Gavin was saying, as I said earlier, I think hydrogen is sort of one of the energy sources that we may well be using or use part of or use partially. The thing is, the hydrogen actually is not an energy source. It's a storage mechanism. So you still need energy to make hydrogen. So you just go and, I always say it'd be great if we could don't mine hydrogen on the sun, because that's where you can get lots of it. So we can go and scoop it up in bucket loads. But that's not practical. So right here on Earth, we have to manufacture hydrogen, and we manufacture it using electricity. So again, you need to have clean electricity that's manufacturing hydrogen. Otherwise, you've completely destroyed the intent of that value chain. You've got something that's clean made with something that's really dirty. You've got to build all of these correct value chains through. And it all does start with energy. And at the end of the day, the cleanest energies we're going to get today, and I'm sure you can throw another one or two in here, but it's probably going to be solar, it's going to be hydro, it's going to be geothermal, it's going to be wind, and maybe wave or something like that. And we've got to drive those technologies. We've got to drive research around those technologies to ensure that them and leverage them where possible in this country. And I think if we get that baseline right, that the energy is sorted, and it's going to help with the problems we're experiencing with Eskom, because we'll be able to put more load into the network or more energy into the network. It's going to help because it'll be built at certain sources. We talk more and more to people who want to put solar and battery technology to support a charging station so that they're not dependent on the network. So we're going to see a lot of that distribution as well. And I think that will really help.
Thank you for that. Mr. Palmer, maybe you can come in here. Vishal mentioned, I think, a critical point earlier on that deserves to be explored around sustainability. We need to look at the sustainability of transportation at a system level. What are your thoughts on this, and what do you envisage the system to be?
Yeah, thanks. So I think just to also add in to what Gavin mentioned, and also extend on Winston's comments as well. In the sustainability agenda and where we stand today, emissions, from transport emissions, it's about, in South Africa, is about 10.8% to national emissions soon after the electricity sector. Road transport contributes 91.2% to that component. But if we unpack that further, our bigger emission problem in transport is our fuel quality. We are still at Euro 2 fuel quality, where the world internationally has moved on to Euro 5 and Euro 6. And now we have the new legislation of Euro 7, to which petrol and diesel technology can't even meet that. So this is where we have to electrify. An interesting study done in South Africa. If we have to move from Euro 2 to Euro 6 fuel quality, it'll only provide a 12% saving on emissions. If we use electric vehicles and charge through our current Eskom coal-intensive grid, it provides 34% saving on emissions. If we charge through renewables, it'll provide 67%. So already that's, some of the dynamics in terms of that. Then coming it back to a system level, it's certainly the whole, our whole society needs to move sustainable. We acknowledge that the pricing of electric vehicles in all forms, whether it's passenger cars, trucks, or whatever mode, is certainly higher priced in that framework as we stand. And we really need to make sure that, this transition is fully inclusive rather than exclusive in that. So in the aspect of public transport, we've got the mechanisms, and there's already a pilot of electric buses happening in the city of Cape Town, and other modes of transportation already moving in terms of that. So, from a technology point of view, it's, there is the solution, both on mobility and energy as well. We just need to really work together with private sector, government, and all parties involved in getting this transition that it's fully inclusive, because from a technology point of view, both energy and mobility solutions are available. We need to work with the financiers to fund these projects so that we can scale up and drive them forward, because the solutions are there.
100%. Vishal, perhaps you can come in here just to extend from what the other panelists shared as well.
No, thanks. I think your question was related to around what are the transformation concepts that need to be discussed in advancing sustainability. So in my mind, a lot of it starts at the policy level. I still believe that our economic policy needs some rework and rethinking. I understand why it is the way it is, because we are trying our very best to redress the imbalances created through the legacy apartheid system. So that motivates a lot of the reason why we are the way we are configured. However, I think there needs to be a bit of a more established balance in the discussion of economic policy, and connecting with perhaps becoming a little bit more capitalist in our thinking, looking at the top line of the country's balance sheet and looking at how our income is coming around. I think there's a lot of work to be done there. So that will help fund, if we can work on more public-private type of discussions. You would have heard our president talk about social compacting, which is a start and moving in the right direction. I think that will help perhaps look at revenue differently. It will help fund sustainable transport systems, because, in my opinion, the current transport system from a public sector point of view is not sufficient. We are not sustainable. I'm not convinced that the taxi is sustainable, because from a safety point of view. I'm not convinced that airlines are sustainable because of the pricing point of view. So these are exclusionary for various reasons, and they're not connecting us enough like we should be connected. So if we are able to fund, because much of our public transport system really has to come out of the National Treasury's account, and in order to do that, we need to fill the National Treasury's bank account. So in order to do that, we have to adopt, I think, a more measured approach with regard to how government works with the private sector, how we could bring in and leverage the resources available across both entities to create a much sustainable and better connected society. And that would help the overall sustainability discussion, because in that case, transport becomes an enabler, not the core reason of why we're doing something. So again, it's a system within a system. And then if we can get social compacting right, we can get government and private sector to work a lot better and mitigate this revenue constraint that we sit with at a country level. So entities like PRASA, which has dropped fundamentally in terms of its ridership, from 48 million to roughly 1 million in the last 10 years, according to what Stats SA is saying, that's not sustainable, because where are the people and how are they traveling? If we have such a drop in ridership on our national rail system, what is happening? Because I know the unemployment might be part of the reason, but it surely can't be that amount of reason. So I think the unsustainability of PRASA becomes a discussion point, and that needs to be capitalized again because of the lack of maintenance, very similar to the ESCOM discussion. But same thing needs to happen. So policy will drive the way we look at our revenue, our income statement as a country, and it will also, help reconnect our communities that are becoming more and more isolated from each other. Thank you.
100%. Jordan, would you like to add on that, Mr. Jordan?
I think all the points are exceptionally valid. And I think just a couple of things I'd like to highlight. The one is, as you said, we are absolutely moving towards things like public transport. I remember, and I think this is something we mustn't forget, is that when cell phones first came into this country, they were very expensive. But the fact that people bought those cell phones means that today every single person can own a cell phone. And you mustn't underestimate the need for that. So if we try to exclude vehicles because they're expensive and say, oh, but they're expensive, we shouldn't be supporting this, we're just going to delay the benefit that will come to the balance of the community. And I heard, and I won't mention his name, but somebody that's involved in a bus project, and he made a statement where he said that if the bus is 80% more expensive, he can break even. So if the bus hardware is 80% more expensive, you can still break even. Now, at this point, unfortunately, it's probably 120% more expensive, but those prices will come down. Okay, so they'll come down, they'll go past 80 and they'll drop down to being almost price parity. We should see within the commercial spaces, maybe 5 years from now, we'll see price parity between the petrol or diesel equivalent and electric equivalent. And at that point, by implication, he's running at nearly half his cost, his running cost or his operating cost. And that could be translated into better ticket pricing or less increases in ticket pricing. It could be all other economic benefits can come from that. So I think while we have to be looking holistically at that system, we've also got to look and say, right now, this is where we can support the system and we can drive the system. I know of quite a few logistics companies, and I'm sure Gavin knows exactly who all of them are, that are desperately wanting to get to testing electric vehicles, even though they're going to be paying a premium for those vehicles now. Premium because they're new in the market, premium because they will get the first prototypes, they will get the first opportunity to test their business cases and understand how their businesses will transform. And those companies are the ones that create that market. They draw the other things in. They push the pricing down. They allow us to experiment in a safe environment where we can make mistakes because there's only a few vehicles, and we can understand how we've got to transition, that we can transition appropriately. So yes, big system, absolutely important, but that spearhead, the point where we've got to be driving the technology, we've got to find ways of driving that harder and harder. And right now, that is in the passenger vehicle space. It's in the early prototypes coming in by most of the big vehicle manufacturers in terms of trucks. It's the buses. We've got to find ways of incentivizing that spearhead. And, that's where I take my hat off to Hitten and his team, because they've been part of funding some of these projects, and actually putting money in to ensure that the bus project gets off the ground and try to help to break those differences. And that is what's going to change our destiny with these things.
Thank you. So Hitten, maybe you can come in here, since Mr. Jordan mentioned some of the initiatives that your organization is doing. Can you tell us more about that?
Yeah, thanks. So I think just to add on from Vishal's comments as well. So remember that along the broader aspect of disruption, government financing is also being disrupted. If we look at the fuel levy, technology is maturing in terms of even the petrol and diesel technology. What a vehicle used to consume per 100 kilometers today versus 10 years ago, government financing is already decreasing from that just based on efficiencies. So, and when we look at that, National Treasury is busy working on it already. They've already introduced the carbon tax in terms of that. So really from that perspective, it's a polluter pay principle that applies. And that applies internationally all over, in that's how we fund this transition in this interim phase from a financing perspective. And that's where government comes into play, and the various finance instruments that are in play. We already do have some fiscal instruments already that already apply that mechanism of the polluter pay principle, and obviously the recently introduced, although it's a phased approach, the carbon tax will move into that space that will really support National Treasury's pot to fund the transitions and government financing to support the policy framework that government has has alluded to in terms of that. Yeah, so in terms of the enabling environment, certainly there's a role that we've been playing in all roles and aspects of the sphere. And I think, pilot projects have their role to play because it what addresses the local aspects in bringing the technology into the market, in addressing the infrastructure challenges, mobility challenges, and everything else, and really taking it into the market and really approving ground to that. So one of the projects that are active is in Cape Town, where there's a pilot of 2 electric buses that are being scaled up into the market for that. The operator themselves has solar at their depot. So again, when we look at load shedding and a cost perspective, it's really addressing the full total cost of ownership from that perspective and really driving the business case for that locally. And it's really a no-brainer for them. From the studies and outputs that we've seen, the benefits are there in terms of scaling up because they proved it in terms of that. The financiers and the board is really looking forward to really scaling up, those orders from what they're doing from a two vehicle pilot into potentially, between 80 and even, beyond that in terms of their next orders. And when we look at the compounding effect, we then start looking at localization for those fleets. From a manufacturing perspective, we have the knock-on of jobs. And I think the jobs component was earlier mentioned. And I want to share a study that was presented within Europe. Europe unpacked the full ecosystem job opportunity for the transition to electric mobility. They've unpacked that 1 million jobs can be created across the electric mobility ecosystem by 2030 in Europe. South Africa has created the National Development Plan of 2030. If we join those 2 dots, that's what the job opportunity has.
Thank you so much for that. Mr. Kelly, would you like to echo some of the sentiments that have been shared?
Yeah, I was going to make some comment around rail. A note was around passenger rail, around PRASA. And there's always discussion around, moving goods from road to rail. And we always call it a discussion. We don't say it's a battle or a fight. And I wanted to bring something in here because it points to what a lot of people have been saying about technology. So what's happened to PRASA? What's happened to passenger rail, public transport? And why is there so much on rail, on road? Well, it's very, very simple. It's efficiency. And this doesn't matter what. So your customer, although that person who wants to be transported is going to go to a mode that is efficient, that is easy to access, that is reliable, that is secure, and that's a huge problem. I mean, now we're being attacked on the roads, left, right, and center for whatever reason, but it's secure, and that has good coverage. And that's really the secret. And I wanted to just talk about rail there. But what the interesting thing is that you would have heard Winston talking about price, and I think even Vishal talked about price. So the customer must want to use something. And I'll give some examples. Think about Netflix and, DSTV and Netflix, the different styles or the different entrenched processes that we've had and how customers move. And please, I'm not saying one company is better than the other, but I'm trying to just give an understanding of what drivers are, what is out there. I think Winston spoke about cell phones. I'm not sure. The whole argument, discussion about the post office and whether the post office is valid and relevant in today and what couriers are doing and the argument around 1 kilogram packages and all this type of story. E-commerce has done to many of our members things that nobody, even just before COVID, e-commerce was still, guys, this is like science fiction. It was like watching Lord of the Rings, and the guys weren't quite sure about this and what have you. And COVID came along, and the 2 words I want to use going forward, they're called disruptors and influencers. And you get a disruptor that suddenly falls on everyone, boom, and Eskom is a disruptor. And I don't mean about what they do, I mean about what they do in our lives. And things change. So 4 or 5 years ago, to get solar in your home, it was going to cost you R500,000 or R1 million. A couple of years down the line, and this is going to my point about the affordability of technology, suddenly you can get a solar solution in your house for 2.5, 3 grand a month, depending on who you go to. Yeah, it might be per month and it might be on an evergreen contract, but it's suddenly no longer out of reach of the middle class. And believe you me, as we go forward, those figures will drop. And so it's going to start going down the, when I say going down the affordability chain, but to those who don't earn as much, it's going to get there. And there will be some type of program, I would think, that we're going to have in South Africa, where, like free water, I think we're going to have programs eventually that will develop where you'll get some sort of a free solar kind of setup for those who can't afford it. Vote for me now. Look at planes. How planes have taken over what trains and ships used to do. Yes, I know we've had issues around with COVID, etc., etc. So there are technology drivers. And some of those technology drivers are ladies. I don't know how many ladies are on the chat, but definitely those listening to us and looking at us, ladies and gentlemen, we are the technology drivers because we speak about it. Many people are going to go home and say, you know, today I heard the most incredible discussion. I think the Oak spoke a lot of nonsense, but there were some points that Kelly said that is making me think either about my business or about me personally. And those are the influences. We're the ones, and those companies, and yes, Heighton or Vishal, there are many companies in the road freight sector who've piloted electric vehicles and dual vehicles with gas and electric and are trying to get something that works. So the change, when you see it, that change makes it real. That's the evolution. So this discussion is part of us evolving and making it more and more palatable and driving the discussion, because there's two things here. There will always be those who can afford and those who can't afford. And where we've got to manage this as an influencer is to ensure that we look after those as best possible without collusion, without destroying other companies, making sure those who can't afford are brought into this change. Otherwise, we just replicate the problems we've made for years.
100%. Thank you very much for bringing attention to the interface that should exist in that regard. So we have a question from Andrew, which I'll just leave it open to all of you on the panel. Perhaps, Michelle, we can start with you in answering it. He asks, how does the pressure from export demand on our vehicle manufacturing to move electric impact us locally? So how does the pressure from export demand on our vehicle manufacturing to move electric impact us locally? Does this pose a risk of some dislocation in what we can cope with or what we will have to produce? Is the question clear?
I think so. I think when I heard the first part, I thought it was the pressure on our local production capacity being influenced by international demand, because I think that's what I'm sort of summarizing. 100%. And I think and if I understand the way the car production market works, each of the entities that produce vehicles work on a bidding principle. They bid in globally for that production capacity to be installed, and they either win or lose that bid, and that's within each of the OEMs. So I think, in my opinion, the demand internationally will almost sort of work itself out, because they are given when they accept the tender or the bid for production, there are already KPIs attached to it in terms of what type of vehicle you will produce for which market and what will be the technology used for that. So I think, in my mind, it kind of it works itself out. We don't really have to fuss too much about it, because the technology that is required to be installed in the vehicles is supplied to the OEM to make the vehicles.
Okay.
Thanks.
100%. Thank you very much. Palmer, would you like to come in there?
Yeah, so, South Africa's automotive industry is a flagship industry that started in 1924. It now contributes pre-COVID 6.8% to national GDP and high employment levels. Unfortunately, that full value chain is really centered around the internal combustion engine, and even more so the component supply industry on terms of that. 60% of the vehicles we assemble and manufacture in South Africa are exported to the EU. Now, EU countries are starting to ban the use of internal combustion engines within various markets from as close as 2023 in some of them. So the retrospect in South Africa is that South Africa is going to lose its principal markets of exports under the current manufacturing value chain in South Africa. So we really need to shift that perspective from automotive manufacturing into new energy vehicles as the framework is given. So currently, that is in a lot of discussions. The DTIC, Department of Trade, Industry and Competition, is working on that framework. And part of the immediate measures for the short term is to try and incentivize the green vehicles or green components manufacturing in South Africa. And I think that will start shifting in terms of that. So it's under threat. We need to really drive the transition into new energy vehicles from a manufacturing perspective. And that's what's going to drive economic transformation from a productivity point of view and secure, but not only secure, but to grow our exports. If we look at the South African Automotive Master Plan of 2035, it wants to take South Africa's global participation to 1% of the global markets. And if we are not manufacturing electric vehicles or new energy vehicles, then we're going to lose that.
Sure. Mr. Jordan, you want to come in there as well briefly, or have you been covered?
Other than reinforcing what Ethan said, it's
Okay.
really our big market is Europe. We need to manufacture to their requirements and to what they're looking for. South Africa is a small portion of that offtake. We benefit from it, but at the end of the day, it's about moving with where the world standards are going.
Thank you very much. So I'm gonna request that you all do your closing remarks. So we'll start with you, Mr. Kelly, then we'll go to Mr. Luchman, and then Palmer, and we'll end off with you, Mr. Jordan.
Oh, thanks very much, and I appreciate the opportunity and the honor to have had a couple of things to say, and hopefully what we've been saying has had some resonance with everyone who's watching today and has got some little trains of thought around a lot of sustainability issues, and understanding it isn't just about fuel or power sustainability. There are a whole number of other aspects that link into that very important topic. So some of the things that are happening right now, just out of interest, is that one of the important things around things like electric vehicles is where do you charge them? And one of the things you need to take into consideration is where do vehicles stand for a long time? So you're not going to drive your 200, 300 kilos down the road, depending on what type of vehicle you have, what capacity it has, and then suddenly look for, like you do with a diesel vehicle, is there a filling station nearby? So there are lots of discussions with what we call distribution centers, where there could be, should be, I suppose, use all of those terms, charging facilities for the vehicles while they stand there. While they're standing on a dead piece, they're not moving, they can be charged there. And that would be accessible to all size and level of transporter. So inclusivity in terms of assisting everyone to move to a green approach in terms of not only carbon footprint, which I said I'm not an expert on, but in terms of greener, sustainable energy, and ensuring that everybody has the opportunity to make those evolutionary changes is very, very impossible. Once again, I look forward to where we're going to go. I think we're going to have probably 5 years of very interesting development. A lot of people think this is 20, 30 years away. No, it's not. 30 years might be to perfection, but this is going to get to us a lot quicker than what we really think. Thank you very much for the time.
100%. Thank you very much. That was Mr. Gary Kelly, CEO of Road Freight Association. Thank you for that. Mr. Luchman?
Thank you, Tabang. My closing remarks are really around, again, sticking to my initial thinking was around the system. And there's an acronym that I would like to use to explain that in my closing remarks. I think the overall intentions, especially for us in South Africa, should really be around achieving SDG number 11, which relates to sustainable communities. So whatever transformation happens in whichever space, transport, power, we really have to connect the initiative with the value that we could bring to improve the socioeconomic circumstances. And connecting those two is probably easier said than done. And I'm partly guilty of that because I'm saying it. So the second thing is the technical, and technical really it comes on the back of being backed up by a quality education system. There's industrial development that is always the talking point. There's innovation and infrastructure that is required to support a sustainable system. And I'm sort of steering away from perhaps my colleagues, which are really related to technology, but I'm talking about how do we get rail running and working again? How do we get the freight system to do what it needs to do, because certain SOCs have lost, perhaps lost their grip on how they actually should operate a rail system.
Yeah.
The economic value, and that's the third one, and I've got two more, really targets SDG number 8, which is economic growth. And that's a straightforward concept, which is these initiatives should really start to grow this economy. And there's the opportunity, because when we do not have change, we find it difficult to grow. Here is an open and waiting opportunity to grow in a new way and change. And that's where, for us at the economic level, there's value that can be extracted from that discussion. Environmental is a key component of whatever solution we put in there, because we really have to leave a planet better off than we found it. And the current trajectory is not going in that direction. So in this transition, in terms of technology and evolution in the transport space, environmental concepts have to be appreciated. So in that, there's 3, and there's SDG 13, SDG 14, which is life below water, and then SDG 15, which is life on land. Those are very broad concepts, but if you unpack it, you'll see that it's very applicable to us, but we don't have the philosophy and the ideology to implement it. And the last one is obviously political. And political is the one where we sometimes get paralyzed and we get knotted in terms of how do we execute politically, because we are so fragmented from the socioeconomic and the political nuances that are currently playing out in our leadership space. And that if that doesn't get fixed, a lot of other things do not get enabled. So thank you, Chair, and thanks for talking.
Thank you very much. That's Managing Director of Transport at Zutari, Mr. Vishal Luchman. Thank you very much for those sentiments. Truly appreciated. Mr. Palmer?
Yeah, thank you, Tabang. It's been a great conversation. I think each of the fellow panelists have raised very important points and perspectives, as well as aligning to the theme of the event of the Sustainability Summit. I think sustainability is key. It has to happen. Not only within transport, we need to look at energy, finance mechanisms, and everything else. The future customer and our emerging customer is sustainability conscious, and that's what's going to drive that. The transition is inevitable, and it's already started, including here in South Africa. We have activities, we have vehicles available, it's going to grow. We have infrastructure available to charge them. We've got an opportunity to exploit our renewable energy accessibility in South Africa that is abundant. We need to have this transition that's inclusive to make sure that none of the members within our society are left behind. And I think all of this speaks to implementation and attainment of the SDGs, as Vishal also mentioned, at a global level, but also locally in terms of our green transport strategy, of which strategic pillar 8 is promotion of hybrid and electric vehicles, but also of our national development plan of 2030. So, in terms of this agenda and transition, we can certainly achieve all of those, both locally and internationally. And look forward to this transition as we move forward. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That was Mr. Highton Palmer, Executive and Thought Leader at Uyilo Electric Mobility Program. Thank you for that, especially just, bringing to reality how conscious we need to be about sustainability. Thank you for that. Mr. Jodvan?
Thank you. And I think it's one of these really difficult things to follow is with a team like this, they really summarize it really well. What I'd like to just put out there, and that is that, partially what Hitten said, we are already there. And I'm going to move just out of the way that you can see what that looks like. That's all of the charging stations in South Africa already. There's no vision, there's not a dream, there's not the future. This is where the chargers exist. You can buy an electric vehicle. You can drive it across the country. You can get involved in this revolution. A large of those charging stations are with already got clean energy. They already have solar backup on them. So based on that, I think that it's really about taking action now and looking and saying, how part of this revolution and drive it. And there's two parts to that. And for me, it's what can I do now? Right now, you can go out, you can buy an electric vehicle, you can drive to Cape Town. Not from Cape Town, from Japan. So the idea is that you can actually do it right now. This is not the future. But at the same time, I do agree that we have to have clean energy. That's going to take us 5 years. We have to have inclusive systems that are going to move into other economies. That's going to take 2 or 3 years. We've got to change certain views that we have. But let's take action on the things we can do now and not just talk about all these futuristic things that may or may not happen and that to some extent are still limited to potential change or to transition. So I really believe that we need to take action and move.
Thank you so much, Jordan. That was thank you. That was Winston Jordan, MD at Grid Cars. Please do check them out. So thank you so much to all of you for just, at the heart of people, goods and services is transportation. And you really did paint that picture. And you're right, Jordan, it starts now. It starts with the systems that Mr. Luchman was talking about. But also, I love how we just, integrated all the segments, economic value, communities, as well as politics, making sure that there's an interface. So all the best to all of you and your respective organizations. And thank you for the work that you're doing to ensure that we have sustainability in transportation. Thank you. Thanks for your time. Till then.
Bye-bye.
Yes, bye-bye.
Thank you.